journey. I'm Steve and thank you for joining me. After last week's look into ISO, which is linked up here, we are going to go further around the exposure triangle. So we talked about ISO, this week is shutter speed, and then next week will be aperture. And remember that the exposure triangle is looking at how well exposed your picture is, whether it's bright, whether it's dark, and this to a certain extent is a creative choice. If you've got a manual setting, you're in control over that final exposure of your picture. As well as being able to control this in manual mode, you can use the semi-auto mode of shutter priority. I do this by selecting an S on the dial on my camera like this, and this means that you set your ISO for whatever conditions you're shooting in. You can control the shutter speed, so if you know that you want to freeze that action, you set a fast shutter speed. If you want a longer exposure to let more light in, then you set a slower shutter speed. Then your camera will control the aperture to adjust the exposure to get a good balance, and that's how it kind of works with semi-auto mode rather than manual mode where you're in full control of all of those aspects. What is shutter speed? In its simplest terms, it is how quickly the shutter opens and closes to allow light into the camera. And this controls how much light actually hits that sensor. The longer the exposure time, so a slow shutter speed, the more light that will actually come into the camera and onto that sensor. The shorter the amount of time, so the faster the shutter speed, the less light that will come in. So obviously if you're changing the amount of light coming in, you'll need to change the other aspects of your photography, your exposure triangle, in order to keep the brightness of the exposure of that final image the same. For example, the Nikon Z5 allows me to have a shutter speed anywhere from about 30 seconds down to 1/8000th of a second, so a huge range. And as you can tell from that huge range, there's a big variety in the amount of light that will come into the camera when that shutter button is pressed, and therefore how bright or how dark that image is at the end. Here, this is our shutter speed. So as you can see, we've got our options here. So we can go faster, and the fastest that we can go on here is 1/8000th of a second. And then you've got two options. You've got the double arrow and the single arrow. The single arrow will take it down step by step of what's available. But let's go back to the top. If you go down by the double arrow, it goes down one stop at a time. So you'll see that every time you press it now, it halves the number. So it halves the amount of light that is coming into the camera. So that's an easy way to get higher or lower exposure. And as we keep going down, you will soon see that we're now down to 1/1.6 of a second. Now we're up to 1.3 seconds, 2.5 seconds, 5, 10, 20 and 30 seconds. So 30 seconds is as far as you can go with a kind of manually controlled option. And then you have time and bulb mode, which are your two slightly special functions. Rather than having a set time for the shutter to open and close, with time mode, when you press the shutter button once, it will open the shutter and begin taking the picture. You then need to press the shutter button again to tell the camera that that's it, that's the end of the picture. It will close the shutter and then process the picture that you've taken. With bulb mode, you press the shutter button and keep your finger on it for as long as you want to expose that picture for. Once you have got the exposure that you want, you let go of the shutter button and the camera will then close the shutter and process the picture that you've taken. So I think the first question is, what is a shutter? So in a mirrorless camera, the shutter works like a blind on a window. It comes down so that no light can come in. It comes back up to allow light in, and then again comes back down in order to stop the light coming in, and that's when your picture's taken. But unlike the blinds that I've used, this is very quick, very accurate, and can be used again and again and again without any change to how it performs. So it's incredibly quick. It's a great piece of engineering, really. So as I said, my Nikon will allow the fastest shutter speed to be 1/8000th of a second. So that means it's going open and then closed again in 1/8000th of a second, so fairly quickly. And the thing to remember is that this happens every time you press that shutter button. So if you're taking a burst of 5, 10, 15 pictures, then that is going to happen every single time. It opens and then it closes again. Then the next question is, what's a good shutter speed to use? As I mentioned, changing the shutter speed can help you freeze motion or create a blur in your images, so it depends what look you're going for. To stop fast motion, you want to be opening and closing that shutter really quickly. So for example, you might want a shutter speed of faster than 1/500th of a second, so that it freezes that motion. But obviously this depends on the subject that you're taking a picture of. If they're moving even faster than that, you may even want to go quicker with that shutter speed. How slow you can go with this is in part controlled by how well supported your camera is. So if you're hand holding something, you're not going to be as stable or get it as completely still as if it was on a tripod. So if you're hand holding, you may want to go down to about 100th of a second depending on your camera, but with a tripod you can go far slower than that, so 30 seconds plus really. So again, got some pictures here of fast shutter speeds and slow shutter speeds, and we'll just have a look at the difference between the two. So this first one was taken in Devon and it's a nighttime shot looking out across the river, across the harbour, to the lights on the other side. You can see the village there and all the different colours of the lights reflected in the water, and you can see quite a lot of detail in the picture really. So as you can see, this was a 30-second exposure with an ISO of 100 and an aperture of f6.3. And the main thing that we're looking at today is the fact that this is a 30-second exposure. So this was on a tripod, and this was a picture that we kind of sat there, looked at the view, and then wanted to take a picture to kind of capture it. And a slow shutter speed is what was needed to capture enough light coming into the picture so that you could actually get these details that you can see on here. It would have been far too dark with a faster shutter speed. So tripod was needed to make sure that it was nice and still, that there was no movement in the camera during that 30-second period where the shutter was open, because any movement there is going to create blurring and just not give quite the effect that I was after. What you can see though is this car was travelling along the road here, and you can see their brake lights lighting up across there as they went along, so you can tell that it's a long exposure because of that. But what's quite nice is all of the details here, the amount of light that you can see reflected in the water, the shadow of the hill, the colour of the sky, and it's all of these bits that, because the light has longer to come into the sensor, the camera had more detail to actually work with. So that's kind of the overall picture, and you can see how nice it looks basically. This is the opposite. This is a much faster shutter speed, as you can see, 1/8000th of a second, f2.2 and an ISO of 200. So the ISO was bumped up slightly to make sure that enough light was coming in to get a nicely exposed image. This was on a photography course that I took part in, and we were using a fountain as our subject because, as you can see, this is a great place to look at for moving water and to try and freeze that action. So you can see these water droplets. This was a full running fountain. Up at the top you can see the water coming out in basically a smooth line, so that's travelling even faster than the 1/8000th of a second. But you can see all these small water droplets as the water is cascading down the fountain, and into the pool at the bottom. So that's an example of what you can get with a fast shutter speed. You can freeze that water in time and see the details of it there. Here it is in black and white, which just gives you a slightly different view of it, and you can see down here the water droplets. And then if we zoom into this central section, there's the contrast of the light of the water droplets and then the dark shadows of the trees in the background, which I really like that contrast between the two. When you get your shutter speed wrong, or a subject unexpectedly moves, this is the kind of effect that you can get. And as you can see, this was at 1 second, ISO of 100, f22 to try and get as much in focus as possible. The goal had been to take a picture of this view, this row down between the trees, this pathway with the leaves in the foreground and just the trees in the background. However, I was out with Ruby. She decided to come and join in and get in the picture as well. But as you can see, she didn't just sit still and wait for her picture to be taken. She was very much moving. And as the shutter was open for a whole second, she moved quite a lot in that time. The areas that she was most still, for example this back leg, you can see are quite well defined. The areas that she was moving quite a lot, for example her head, are translucent. You can see through it. You can see the bits of the background that were still behind her, and with her moving across in front of it, you can see where she was, what she was doing, but it comes out like this blur and this kind of not full opacity Ruby. You can see through her. She's kind of ghost-like really, but it gives an interesting effect, and certainly wasn't what I was after with that not particularly slow exposure, but it was one that I was hoping would look a bit different. And then as you can see, ones with Ruby, this again is back to 1/8000th of a second, catching her mid jump into the lake, and it's freezing her in time. You can see individual hairs and things. Problem with this photo is that my focus was off. I have ended up focusing on these lilies behind her, so she is a bit blurry, but you can still see it's frozen her in time in mid-leap into the water. This was a fairly dark area. As you can see, my ISO was up to 3200, whereas previously, even when I was up to 1/8000th of a second for my shutter speed, I still managed to keep the ISO lower than this. So that's just a few examples of my own photos and how they can be affected by either a slow or a fast shutter speed, and what can happen in any of them really if the subject moves, if there's problems that you haven't foreseen coming. As I mentioned, changing that shutter speed brings about different creative opportunities. We've all seen those pictures of smooth flowing water, streaking car lights on a dark road, or spelling out words and letters with sparklers. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got animals that are running full speed and they're just captured perfectly, pin sharp. You've got drops of water from a waterfall or from something being dropped into water. And particularly things like fast-paced sports, so racing cars, cricket balls, footballs, that kind of thing that are moving quickly, you want to be able to stop them in time so that you've got a nice sharp picture. So whether you're after a slow shutter speed or a fast shutter speed, you can create some very different looks in your pictures. The biggest difference in what you can achieve as a slow shutter speed with your camera is whether you're hand holding it or whether you're using a tripod. Obviously, if you're hand holding it, you're not going to be anywhere near as stable, no matter what you do, as you are if you use a tripod. You won't be able to capture images with as slow shutter speeds. You'll naturally introduce some blurring as you move slightly. Using a tripod allows you to have that complete control over the stability of the camera. You need to make sure that your tripod is sturdy enough. that is weighted down if you're in a windy environment or something like that, and that your camera is well connected to it. But once you've mastered those parts of setting up your tripod, then you can have really long exposure times and create some fantastic results with those slow exposures. An easy way to demonstrate this is with running water. So if you've got a fountain nearby you, then you could try taking pictures of it with a slow shutter speed and with a high shutter speed. Thank you for joining me today while we talked about shutter speeds. Like, subscribe and comment on this video, ask any questions that you might have, and then join me again next week as we complete the exposure triangle and talk about aperture. Have a great week. Bye.